Hi, everybody. My name is John Bell, and this is Braven Bushcraft. I just wanted to get on to do a quick note about talking about a few little things in shorter segments than I normally do on my other show, which is the Harbinger Report, on also on YouTube. But on this one, I'm trying to do the format a little bit different. A lot of times, this one isn't geared as much towards guests, although I will have guests on occasionally, as I do with my first show on here. But this is just to cover some important topics in a shorter format. So getting into that, the topic I want to get into today is survivalism versus bushcraft, because not a lot of people have a clear understanding of those two concepts. They kind of blend them all into one. And the fact is, they're different philosophies, all right, and different views, you could say, on how to look at the subject of survival in general, or survival skills, et cetera, et cetera. I came at this a little bit of a different way, because bushcraft is a kind of a new term in the last 10 years or so, pretty much in the United States, give or take. What happened, I grew up in the US and served in the services and everything, and was trained as a police officer, and the whole notion of survivalism was different. It was more like Rambo style. What happens if you're dropped off in a location and you got to find your way out and, navigate all the pitfalls and dangers in doing so, kind of like Bear Grylls on his show, right? Which I love. But anyway, that said, bushcraft is a little bit different. I went to study abroad in Europe in 2007, 2008. And I was surprised to find out, like, the European notion of survivalism was called bushcraft. And you had people that were rising stars back then, like Ray Mears, all right? Ray Mears, still around today, but he was a big star back then, especially in Europe, and was a big bushcraft guy. So America didn't have this kind of understanding of bushcraft as much, I noticed when I came home. Now, over time, that started to, disseminate more and more into the US. And now we actually have bushcraft schools and things like this that focus on bushcraft. But what is bushcraft, right? So we all know an idea of survivalism in the sense that, you get gear, you have some degree of prepping or gear. You've got backpacks, you've got tents, you've got sleeping bags. You've got good high-speed Gore-Tex jackets, right? Gore-Tex boots, that kind of thing. This is all stuff that's very common to people that do hiking, camping, or into, prepping, survivalism, whatever, across the gamut. It's all kind of thrown into one. But the idea of bushcraft is, like I said, it's a completely different philosophy. Whereas, and I'm oversimplifying here, of course, but this is just so the general audience that might not have a distinction could understand a little bit better between the two subjects or philosophies, or just views, I guess, on the topic. And that said, so in survivalism, like I said, it's more focused on how do you survive, particular things. And a lot of times it's how to get out of danger and back to society, right? Bushcraft's a little different in the sense that it's not trying to escape danger and, being stranded in the wilderness, trying to find your way home. Bushcraft is more about how to almost, I don't want to say abandon society, but to learn how to live in nature more comfortably, and in a relationship where it's very focused on conservation, right? In other words, you're trying to find a blend of your impact on the environment to where you're not harming the environment. You only take what you need as far as sustainability, and so it has a big focus on that. But it's about living in harmony with nature more. And it's not about trying to get out of an emergency and get back to civilization. It's more of about how to learn to live in nature in a I don't want to say like a hippie way, but like in a cooperative way, where it's more natural, more substance based in a sense. So that's a little bit of the difference. Now, one of the major issues with the two are in the gear is very different for survivalism and for bushcraft. All right. So whereas in survivalism we have these high speed, high tech, backpacks, and now there's a rage for lightweight or ultralight packing and all, which is great. That's awesome. I love that stuff. I've got all kinds of gear across the board. I have the fancy backpacks for hiking, for mountain climbing, and I've even got the newer stuff for the ultralight stuff. And I've got packs just specifically for hunting. Um, let's see, I've got Artitech high speed gear climbing bag for the mountains. I think it's about probably anywhere from a 40 to 600 or 60-liter bag. I've got the new ultralight stuff that's also 40 and 60-liter bags, depending on if I'm going longer or shorter. I've got bushcraft bags. I've got specifically bushcraft. I've got Mystery Ranch hunting packs for going, and Badlands for going hunting. I've got kind of a day pack, Badlands day pack when I go hunting. If I'm going out for any longer time, I've got my Mystery Ranch bag that's like a 60-liter bag that can hold a lot more and has a meat shelf in it. So if I was ever going hunting in a place where I've got to carry the meat out for any reason, I'm going to bring a pack that has a meat shelf. And, that's a huge, huge thing. And in time, I'll do shows specifically on each one of these bags and their pros, cons to an extent, just, general knowledge, just give people a general understanding of this kind of stuff. When it comes to a bushcraft bag, though, bushcraft bags are made, like I said, it's a different philosophy and it's different gear. The bushcraft bags, a lot of times, are made of canvas. A lot of times people prefer canvas bags. They are heavier, but they're proven over the centuries and just take a beating and keep on going. That's the thing. One philosophy difference in bushcraft versus survivalism is a concept that people don't really understand or think about as much today is our modern gear, the high speed stuff that they sell at these camping stores like REI and other local backpacker stores. They've got nice gear, no doubt, and it's nice, but a lot of it is very synthetic materials, thin materials, and although they work and they do the job, they're not designed for long-term exposure or use. They're just not. Um, they are designed for weekend campers. I'm going hiking for a week. I'm going on a single expedition kind of thing. Now that doesn't mean that some of your gear. I mean, I have tents that have lasted for years, but how much have I used those tents? I mean, I've used them plenty of times, but I've never lived out of one. You see what I'm saying? If you're living out of a tent, even the UV sunlight's going to end up destroying that tent over time. It's not made to be a permanent solution. But see, that's where bushcraft is different. Bushcraft is more about my gear can last me, even though it's simple gear. It lasts me for forever. If I take care of it, it will always last, or at least it'll be much, much more durable than standard gear. So that's one thing I find amazing about it. And to give you an example of this, think about a focus would be, think about what soldiers carried during the Civil War. A lot of times they either could carry what they had on their back in a small pack, or they would have like a wheel wagon that would have, store their larger amounts of gear, or say cowboy tents, that kind of stuff. Also look at frontiersmen and cowboys, same thing. Frontiersmen, and then you've got a whole separate subject really of cowboys, because cowboys and ranches across the country over time have had to live off of horseback and chuck wagons. And in the chuck wagons, they'll carry their larger bedroll, and they'll carry their cowboy tents, as they were called. And it's basically a bedroll is just a canvas, basically sleeping bag, almost. I mean, it's not exactly what it is, but you have a sleeping pallet if you will. You can put a sleeping bag in there, but in older times, it's just wool blankets. and then you wrap this in canvas as an outer covering or protection from the elements. And a lot of times they would have a cowboy bedroll that they keep on the back of their saddle and in the pack, and it's just a little bedroll rolled up, and it wouldn't be much. It'd be a wool blanket and canvas tarp kind of thing. And then, like I said, in the chuck wagon, they would have bigger blanket bedrolls, and they would have that were much larger. And then they would have cowboy tents, which would be like zip up almost canvas tents. A lot of times it's like a little teepee. A lot of times they were square as opposed to round. Sometimes they're round, but it's just a little canvas teepee, usually no larger than 9 feet. Sometimes you'd have a 10-foot, but that was common back in those days. Now, Civil War soldiers, they would be lucky if they had, a chow wagon and supply lines, but sometimes they didn't even have that and just had what they had on their back. And same thing, they would carry a bedroll on them, and this bedroll would consist of a wool blanket or two. It would consist of, which was basically their sleeping bag, if you will. It also consisted of a canvas tarp. A lot of times, like even in the military today in infantry school, they'll talk about having a shelter half. In an infantry school, they give you this canvas shelter half, and you always have a battle buddy, your partner you're assigned to. They would also have one, and you could snap the two together to form basically an A-frame tent. And each side would have a little closure on the end, so you could have a small tent. But if you didn't have your battle buddy for some reason, you would have to just make a lean-to out of that, and then make a little bedding underneath. And that's what Civil War soldiers did. They had shelter halves, basically tarps, and like I'm using in this thumbnail as an example for the show today, is a canvas tarp, or also what's called a oilcloth tarp. Oilcloth tarp is just a thinner cotton material, almost like a bed sheet, give or take. Not quite canvas, but a lightweight that would be treated to where it's going to be water resistant. And it would be an oilcloth is just a lighter version of a canvas tarp, because unfortunately canvas, though very durable, is also heavy. So you've got to moderate your weight that you're going to carry, especially if you're surviving off of what's on your back, so to speak, like these soldiers did. So they would have a shelter half / tarp. They would have a wool bedding of some type, a wool blanket or two. And they would also have some type of ground cloth to lay their bedding on. Sometimes soldiers in the Civil War carried what became popular for a while was a thing called gum blankets. A gum blanket is a canvas tarp on one side, but they had, I think it was Goodyear, had a latex rubber that they could paint on the other side. And this became very popular because among Civil War soldiers, because it gave them a water barrier from the ground that would keep them dry, even when it's raining and water's flowing through, kind of thing. Also, a lot of times they'd put a slit in the middle of it to where you could open it up and wear it as a raincoat, okay, which was very useful. Now you've got double purpose. You've got a raincoat and that. Another thing, sometimes they would even put holes in their wool blankets, because now if it's cold outside, they can take their bedding, they can put the wool blanket on, and then they can even put the poncho on top of that and have waterproof sustainability that traps in a lot of their heat. Okay. So that way your winter gear, clothing, and wet gear and your bedding was all one system. Okay. So just being more efficient. So you're carrying lighter gear, lighter material. Well, it's actually heavier gear, but you're carrying less of it, and it serves a dual purpose. All right. But here's the thing. A canvas tarp, and a wool blanket, if you take care of them, will last a very, very long time, if not your lifetime or your grandson's lifetime, if you will, as long as you take care of them, And there's always, I mean, this is general. There's always going to be times where things can. Here's another thing too. Say you rip your wool blanket, or or your canvas tarp. You just get a hole in it somehow, which, you know, that's very common if you're trying to live or spend a long time out in the wilderness. Well, these are materials that are easier to sew, and you can fix them. A lot of times soldiers carried a little sew patch kit, and it's easy to sew these things up, and then your gear is good. It's a lot harder to do that with modern tents and technology. Sure, they have little, you know, glue on patch kits, and that's nice. I recommend them. But again, that just doesn't hold up as over time as well as canvas does, as well as wool does. Even sleeping bags. Sleeping bags are fantastic, and I think everybody should have them. And I love them, and I got a bunch of them. But I really prefer the wool too. You know, especially if you're in a shelter half. A lot of times they'll create a fire just outside the shelter half just to provide warmth in cold weather, or for cooking dinner, etc. And you got to think about embers coming, you know, eventually getting to your sleeping bag, to your tarp, to your shelter. If this was a nylon tent or even a nylon sleeping bag, you're going to get holes all through that stuff. I mean, it only takes one little bitty tiny ember, and now you got a hole in your, you know, super expensive sleeping bag. You know, it could be $300 or more, you know. So wool and canvas, though, they hold up against being around campfires much better. That includes jackets, by the way. I mean, it doesn't matter what kind of bedding you have. Most times you're going to want to make fires for cooking or warmth or whatever in the wilderness, and you just get one little ember on your jacket, and same thing, you got a hole now in your fancy Gore-Tex waterproof gear, you know. So again, if you had a wool coat, it would, or even canvas, it would be able to sustain itself around campfires much longer, much better than these thin little high-speed nylon materials. So so those are important things to consider. So bushcraft gear models itself not exactly on Civil War and frontier days and cowboys, but that would be a much better way of understanding it. I have a philosophy in survival and bushcraft called hardware over software. You know, we've heard this growing up many times. They used to always tell us hardware over software, hardware over software. And that's when the computer rage was coming up. You know, software is a lot more sketchy than hardware, and hardware is more reliable than software. Well, I'm taking that same philosophy in a sense and trying to adapt it to bushcraft survival situations. Whereas if I had a choice between a high-speed, expensive, sometimes like anywhere from $100 to $600 Gore-Tex high-speed, you know, modern material jacket versus some simple Cohort canvas that every plant worker has going to work every day, I would prefer the Cohort canvas, really. Now, just running around town and it's raining like it is here today in the last 3 days of monsoons where I'm at, I mean, just nonstop rain for 3 days. Having a lightweight little, you know, raincoat's great, and if I'm just going out on a weekend kind of thing or something, you know, again, having a little Gore-Tex shells is fantastic. However, if I'm going to be staying long-term in the wilderness or trying to live there, then I'm going to want to have canvas. And you can always do wax canvas, which makes it not waterproof, but water resistant. But you can also just put on a poncho like we talked about before. And there's varying sizes of that, anything from like a military poncho, or they make oilcloth ponchos or canvas ponchos. Now, those are going to be a bit heavier. I've got oilcloth ponchos. In fact, I think I got one next to me. I've got, there's a company called Bushcraft Spain. All right, I just created an avalanche. There's a company called Bushcraft Spain, and I love this company. A lot of people in bushcraft like this company. This is oilcloth, all right? It's not quite canvas. It's thin. You see that light passing through it, all right? See my fingers back there? It's a thin material, so it's lighter. That's the point of it. But yet it's still very thick and durable, and being the oilcloth, it's water resistant, all right? This is a basic tarp fold out tarp. Now it's going to weigh, this joker probably weighs about four plus pounds. So it's not light, but the difference is it will last. It will last a very long time if I take care of it. And this is a larger oilcloth I have for longer distances. And if I have access, this isn't the kind of thing I'll carry in my backpack because it's just too big and heavy. But if I've got a vehicle or something like that, or if I'm staying in a place for a long time, this can make a great shelter. It's all kinds of things you can do with this. You can even turn this bad boy into a very functional tent. So that's why I've got it, and it lasts. So yeah, stay there. So anyway, that's just some differences. So gear tends to be heavier. Again, hardware over software. So this would be software. A canvas jacket would be hardware, you know. So those are things to consider. Other tools and stuff in bushcraft. A bushcraft person always carries a bushcraft knife. Usually it's nothing fancy. Well, it can be, but it's usually a blade around 3 to 4 inches. All right. It's not very big. Now you can have 5 and 6, but that starts getting really big. I had one built for me at 6 inches because I'm thinking American ease, and really it's too big. It gets in the way. It's too big. A bushcraft knife is made a very particular way. I'll be doing shows just explaining on what a bushcraft knife is, because it's a very particular style of knife. So I won't go deep into that right now because I'll save that for a later show. Just describing what a bushcraft knife is compared to other types of knives, because they're very different. And they're basically a small utility knife, but you rely on that utility knife for just about doggone everything. So you can use it for just all the overwhelming majority of bushcraft needs requires a small knife. And it doesn't have to be super fancy or anything like that. But one difference is, and I'll be doing shows on this too, is it's carbon steel, tends to be carbon steel versus stainless. Simply because carbon steel, it holds a better edge than stainless steel. And it is also easier to sharpen than stainless steel. So in fact, a lot of hunters I know skin animals with carbon steel knives specifically for that purpose. Now they've got all the fancy, I'm going to do the lazy replace a blade. And I used to make fun of my buddies that hunt until I had to skin an animal with them, and I didn't sharpen my little carbon steel knife. So they're like, "Here, man." And I'm like, crap. But I got to say, using that joker was so easy and so fast. I went and bought some for Christmas. But I always say, again, hardware over software. That would be software. See, the concept of software, the way I'm using it, is it something that wears out or has to be replaced? You got to replace those. They don't bother sharpening them. In our go society, they just replace them. You know, it's faster and easier a lot of times. So, but in a bushcraft world, you're not replacing blades. You're taking the time to sharpen them. So you have less blades, but you're able to maintain it longer. It takes an extra step. That's another thing about bushcraft. Our world today is so fast, rush. In bushcraft, you really have to slow down. You got to slow. It's a different way of life. You have to force yourself to slow down. And here's one reason why. It doesn't take, if I use my knife here, if you're doing, and I chose this knife because it's a utility style knife that you can use for many bushcraft needs and with an adequate length blade. All right. But here's the thing. If you're using this knife, there's another concept that's very important. You know, in society today, if you get hurt, it's very easy to call an ambulance. It's very easy to get yourself to a hospital. It's very easy to get emergency care. If you're out in the wilderness, the nearest hospital might be a very long way away. You might not have time to get out. You might not have time to be able to get help. So you have to self-rescue. So one thing you've got to learn in the bushcraft or even survival mindset for that matter is you've got to slow down, because there are techniques. Like, I took bushcrafting courses where we were never able, there was only specific ways we could use our knife, and it was a pain in the butt, and it was counterintuitive, and you didn't like it. It wasn't fun, but it was all designed so that you don't accidentally cut yourself. Because if you cut yourself, you might not have a chance to get to a hospital. So that being the case, you have to slow down and you have to be careful. And again, it goes to that old saying, you can do something 1,000 times. You only have to mess up one time. In fact, I got a big cut on my finger here from where I cut my finger open one time with a knife, and still have you can still see it. So it's a constant reminder. You don't want to have that situation when you're in the wild. So you've got to slow down. You've got to be careful. Another thing is, you need to learn to avoid dangers before you get into them. So, like, for example, and I'll cover this more when it comes to axes and chopping wood, which is also something that's essential in bushcraft. You have a knife and you have an axe almost always, and then a saw of some type, large, small, etc. Like, buck saws are very popular. Also, with modern gear today, these little pop-out saws that are just like this, but a saw, a little bit longer, are also very, very popular. Silky saws can be an example of that. But anyway, so you have to learn there's different techniques I was watching that show Survival one time, and a woman was chopping wood, just kindling for her fire in her little shelter. She slipped and she cut her hand pretty bad with the axe, which only takes once and only takes a second. So she had to quit the show. All right. That was a very, I want to say, really rookie mistake on her part. It can happen to anybody, even pros, but it still was a very rookie mistake. You have to design the chopping of that wood in such a manner that if you slip, your hand's not even there to get cut. And here's what happens with because I've been there 100 times. You're in a situation where you've been packing all day. All right. You're tired. You're cold. You're wet. Your energy is down. So you're not paying super attention to what you're doing. And like I said, it only takes a split second the wrong way, and you could lose a limb. You could lose a digit. So and you might not be where you can get help. So those are things that are super important to understand. Slowing down and thinking about safety, even with the knife work, in such a way where your hand's not in the way in case you slip. Or with an axe, your hand's not in the way, or your legs or your knee isn't in the way in case you slip. You will notice competent bushcrafters and people in the field, when they're using these materials, you'll see that they're chopping woods in certain specific ways to try to avoid that. All right. And there's different techniques for that. And we'll cover those and go into some of those later. But always safety. You got to safety first, always. And slow down. The first rule of safety is slow down. You've got to pay attention to what you're doing. Remove dangers where you could do something and potentially hurt yourself. Do it a different way, even if it's harder. So those are some ideas to keep in mind. So yes, in bushcraft versus survivalism, there's a whole different mindset. One of the rules of bushcraft is the more knowledge you carry in your head, the less weight you carry in your backpack or on your back. So the more in here, the less on here. That's a basic philosophy in bushcraft. Meaning, the more expert you are, the less junk you need to carry. And a lot of these guys, especially on shorter term trips, they'll just carry a tarp, a ground cloth, a wool blanket, and a little mess kit with some food provisions, an axe, a knife, and a saw. And that's it, for the most part. There'll be other little stuff, maybe like first aid kit would certainly be good. Little kits for, sharpening kit, things like that. You can go on, and it gets endless very quickly. One time I was like, and another thing, bushcraft people carry tins, like a little screw metal tin, like an Altoids can for the mints. That's very popular. You hear about that a lot. They carry tins to store things in. And one day I'm like, okay, what tins do I want to store? Well, it quickly turned into like 20 different tins because I'm like, all right, I want a tin um, for having like an antiseptic wipe. Okay, that makes sense. All right, great. Next, oh, I want a tin for having salt because salt's like the most important mineral you can have, and you don't want to lose your electrolytes. So, okay, there's another one. And then, I mean, just go on. I wanted one that was a lip balm. You know, I wanted one that I could use on my wooden handles to preserve them or whatever. You know, I want one as a sunscreen. You know, just it goes on. One's a bug bomb, right? I mean, just on and on. One's just tinder. So if you're trying to start a fire, and if you don't know what that is, I'll cover that in other episodes. Starting fires and what tinder is, tinder bundles, uh, tinder versus kindling, etc. Bird's nest, those kind of things. But anyway, just the next thing I know, I got a stack of tins. You know, almost more than I can carry, just with all the stuff. Not to mention just a tin of just miscellaneous stuff or a fishing tin. That's another great one. You know, that you can have just a little tin where you've just got some hooks, some weights, um, maybe some line wrapped up in there. It takes no space. You can even have little, you know, sinker or a bobber in there. It takes up no weight at all, and you can make an improvised fishing pole. You know, and catch some real fish. So I've done that before. It's a lot of fun. So I mean, those are, you can put some flies in there as well, and you're good to go. So I definitely recommend having these. I call them, you know, pocket fishing kits. Yeah, you don't, doesn't have to be in a tin. It can be in a little like Ziploc pouch. Even that they make these little high speed kits you can buy, but it's just as easy to go to the store and buy what you want and put it in a little tin or something like that. But anyway, that's getting back to the idea of bushcraft versus survivalism. So your gear tends to be heavier in bushcraft, but it's gear that you could literally live out of. You know, if there was like an apocalyptic situation, you don't want the high speed gear. You want the bushcraft gear because it's going to last. But then again, there's only so much weight you can carry reasonably on your back. You know, that's something to be very mindful of because you have a limit on that. Now, especially if you've got to travel long distances. And if you've got to go a long distance, you're going to have to lighten that load one way or another, you know. And another important thing to carry is you always have to carry water, you know. Now, in high speed things today, everyone has these fancy, you know, plastic bottles, or you always see like even the light speed hikers are always carrying water bottles. Problem is, there's a big problem in our population today, what's called microplastics. Look into that. Microplastics. Another thing is um, estrogen mimickers. All of these clear bottles, even the BPA free, which was a bad one, they all can leach estrogen mimicking chemicals into your body, which can mess with your hormones and your health. So you got to be very careful. And when these water bottles are exposed to heat, that makes it even worse, you know, for leaching these chemicals into your drinking water. So that's things you've got to be mindful of. One thing I do, and I'm going to be doing other shows on this later down the line, is talking about different types of containers or cooking ware for camping, for survival, or for just recreational camping, hiking, or bushcraft. I always carry stainless steel. Now, it's going to weigh a little bit more, yes. And again, it's give and take. That's the sacrifice I'm making, is it does weigh more. But as long as you take care of it, it's going to last. And it doesn't leach chemicals into my food. And I can take contaminated water in a uh, stainless steel canteen, and I can put it directly over a fire and purify the water in it as well as the bottle itself. Very quick and easy, as long as it's single walled and not double walled. So keep that in mind. But I can heat it over a fire, and I'm also decontaminating it at the same time. You can't do that with plastic water. You know, you can run different filters, and I'll be doing shows on filters and purification of water and stuff like that, and also in later episodes. But this is just to give a brief, just kind of open understanding, or just kind of some of the differences. So of the mentality of bushcraft. Also in bushcraft, there's a large component of being gentle to nature, you know, being kind to nature. in the sense that we're trying to preserve nature at the same time, not in the sense of some like leftist type of we're raping the planet kind of thing. No, but you still want to be responsible with the environment. You want to be responsible with your campsite. There's a thing of leave no trace behind. So after you camp, you should be able to reset everything, including your fire pit, to where it doesn't look like you were ever there. Especially not leaving fires. Fires start every year, forest fires, because of somebody doesn't know what they're doing with a fire pit and it gets out of hand, or they leave it and think it's out and it carries on. So that's a whole nother subject that's very important that people need to be aware of. But even in conservation of like, there's a rule when I'm taking food like berries or something like that, that you only take so much and you leave the rest. You don't just take everything that's there. Those are concepts, and you take what you need to survive and you leave the rest. And so that's an important philosophy in bushcraft as well. But like I said, it's about living more comfortably, long-term, sustained in nature. And it's a beautiful lifestyle. It's a slower pace. There's a conservation aspect to it. There's just being closer and more at one with nature. Not like modern times where you're just hiking, you're just trying to get from point A to point B and you're out of there. You might stop for a night on the way and that's it. No, bushcraft isn't like that. Bushcraft is you're a part of the environment, and you there's a cooperation there, cohesion. Anyway, it's a lot of fun, but I love I after all the survival stuff I've done and all the gear I've done, and I'm not claiming to be some giant expert, but I've done a lot with this stuff. Not everything. I'm always learning all the time, constantly. I love learning. But I really lean more towards the bushcraft. I love the bushcraft. Now there are times where I'm going to I've got two ultralight backpacks from a company I love that does ultralight backpacking, and that's great. But I also have my canvas bags and my bushcraft gear, and I've got all the fancy sleeping bags, but I love the bushcraft gear. It takes a little bit more skill and it takes a little bit more weight, but it's learning to get back to, like I said, what these cowboys did, what the frontiersmen did, what the mountain men did, what trappers did, what Civil War soldiers carried. I mean, go look up at what Civil War soldiers carried, and because they could carry only the bare minimums. So look at what they carried. But then on top of that, they also had a few items that were just comfort items. Yeah, like whiskey. They always had a cup. but anyway, you get the basic idea. So it's not trying to go into super depth on this. I'm just trying to show kind of a very basic philosophy of the two. I'm not harping as much on what it is to like do survival or camping, for lack of a better word, because most people are familiar with that. Most people have gone camping. Maybe not everybody, I'm sure, today, but most people are familiar with camping and camping gear, and we're inundated with all that stuff, whether you're a camper or not. You're aware of it. You're aware of the gear and stuff like that, and a lot of the do's and don'ts about it. I'm sure it's basic stuff, but the bushcraft side is not something that people understand quite as much, and it does take more education, learning, skill, practice. You've got to practice all skills to be proficient at them. And even myself, there's, in the military, they have a difference between technical and tactical knowledge. I say this a lot. Technical knowledge means you understand something. Tactical knowledge means you can actually perform the skill. Those are two different levels. When I was living in Italy, one year, I watched hours and hours and hours on how to start fire with just without a lighter, and I went out in the wilderness and camped out on this mountain one time, and it turned into a disaster. It was cold, it was wet, it was rainy. I had a ferrocerium rod, and that thing looked like a toothpick by the time I was done with it. You could stab a turkey with it. Like, because I sat there and struck that thing like, I mean, it was a thick one too, like thicker than this pen. And I struck that thing down to nothing. I literally spent 14 hours one night trying to start a fire, thinking after watching all these videos and thinking I knew what I was doing. And then I went out the next day because I'm a determined son of a gun. And I spent another 9 hours trying to get a fire started. I gave up after 14 hours the first day, went back and did another 9 hours the next day trying to do it. And I could not get it done. And a funny story is I was still trying. I was determined even after 9 hours, but I heard a wolf start doing a cry like about 100 yards from me in a bush. And I was like, oh no, he just called for the dinner bell to his little pack. All right. Saying, hey, guys, I found food. Get your butts over here so we can get it. And I was like, okay, I can't get a fire going. I'm out. So as soon as I heard that, I packed my gear and I hauled down that mountain. Let me tell you. Yeah, it was miserable. I'm telling you. I had another time I was run off by a bear, but I'll say that for another story. It was a crazy story. And that was in Big Bear, California. Wow, camping. Anyway, so I'm not going to keep it long. I said it'd be short. I'm already at past 40 minutes, but I just wanted to give a basic idea for differences in camping, survivalism versus bushcraft. Bushcraft is a different world. You can get books on bushcraft. There's a few I recommend. I'll show those in time as I get into more detail and more shows specifically on that topic. But anyway, that's it for now. Thank you everybody for coming. We'll be going into more topics and more detail on the things I'm talking about later. If you have any questions, you can reach me at bravenbushcraft@yahoo.com. bravenbushcraft@yahoo.com. Check out my other channel at Harbinger Report on YouTube. We do paranormal stuff on that side. It's fun. But anyway, so on that side, I talk about dangers in the world and why, and on this side, I give solutions, which is learn survival skills, learn to bushcraft, learn some prepping. Also on here, I'm going to be doing gear review. And on some of that gear review, it's going to be bushcraft stuff. It's going to be tents and high speed gear. It's going to be maybe books, or even one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start doing some movie episodes, TV or comic books on survivalism, like The Walking Dead, and different shows like that, and talking about where they got it right, where they got it wrong, things to consider. One thing I love about those shows is it gets people to thinking about what would you do in these types of situations. Because, in America, we have this thing called normalcy bias, where because we've never had like a societal collapse, we don't believe that one could ever happen. And you know what? We're wrong. We're dead wrong. Now, I pray to God that never happens, not in my lifetime or anyone else's. But that's not reality. In the military and in law enforcement, we train with one philosophy, all right? And that, other than God, family, country, in that order. But the main philosophy we train with is prepare for the worst and hope for the best. But our whole philosophy is in that preparation for that 20% of the time. If you cover that 20% of the time, you're covered already for that 80%. All right, already. You're covered for it's impossible to be covered for everything, but you're covered a whole lot more if you just focus on that 20% and the whole idea of preparing for the worst. So, look, I don't want any bad things to ever happen to anyone, not in this country or other countries. I've traveled around the world and I found that most people are just like us. They're caring, they're loving, they want the best for their family and their children and their country. You know what I mean? So there's too much division in the world today. I'm gonna get off my soapbox, but anyway, you get the idea. And people who think that people are crazy for learning survival skills or prepping, that's not crazy. That's un-American. It's American to be self-sufficient. It's American to not have to rely on others for help. Now, there's a degree where we all need to learn to work together because no person is an island. But we have been founded on being a society of self-sufficient people. that aren't just looking for handouts anytime there's a trouble or problem, you know? It's not to say we don't try and help each other when there is problem. Um, but you get the idea of what I'm trying to say. So anyway, that's the idea. That's the thing. And hopefully a little bit of a preview for more to come on this channel. God bless. And I hope everyone stays well.